Well, good evening. I hate to break up good fellowship, but it's time for us to get started. If you'll be opening up your Bibles to Mark chapter 9, we are continuing our study in the Gospel of Mark, and we're in the second half of the Gospel. And as we've been talking about all along, he's established in the first half of the book here that Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Messiah. And now in the second half, we're proving, teaching what that means. So less miracles, a lot more teaching sections, the suffering statements that we've already been looking at. And Lord willing, we'll see another one this evening if we get far enough in there. But I was kind of kidding with Matt Valley the other day when he taught here in the auditorium. He said something about filling the time. And I said, we're not just filling time. You know, we're changing lives in Bible classes, hopefully. So we're kind of going slow, I guess, but I don't know what pace y'all are used to going, but I'd rather us get the meaning and the application out of it than just run right through it. So anyway, we'll try to, we'll go a little bit quicker than we have been going because, as I told you before, when we got to the end of chapter 8, we really needed to slow down and get that kind of hub of the book there. But last week we talked about the transfiguration, and our section that we're going to talk about tonight occurs as Jesus and the three disciples that he took with him up on the mountain, Peter, James, and John, as they're coming down from the mountain, what happens. Now, we've talked about quite a bit about how that in the book of Mark, the way he's got this structured, especially in the first half, is you would have a miracle section where Jesus performs a miracle of some sort or kind. Then you would have an opposition section where the scribes or the Pharisees or the religious leaders or whatever would try to undermine what Jesus has taught. They've tried to ruin his reputation, those types of things. And then that leads into a teaching section where Jesus either explains to the religious leaders what really is the case, explain to his disciples what they should be focused on, or maybe sometimes a little bit of both. Well, the section that we're coming into tonight really has, I've got it separated, but it's really kind of all three blended into one. It's a miracle section and an opposition section and a teaching section kind of blended into one, and hopefully you'll see that as we go through it. But it's all connected and important for us to really grasp what's going on as we go through this. So let's get into the first little section here. Verse 14 is the scribes arguing with Jesus. And again, you've got this, I've got it written at the top, but you've got this all kind of blended together. But as they came down, this is again coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, wherever that happened to be. They're coming down. There's Jesus, Peter, James, and John. And it says that as they're coming to the disciples, well, the disciples would have been the other 9 of the 12 and some other followers of Jesus probably that had been, you know, we've talked about over and over in the book of Mark that you've got, he really kind of makes a distinction between, there's the 12 that are that inner circle that's following Jesus. There's the disciples who are following Jesus that are the 12 plus some others. And then there's the crowds that are coming to Jesus out of curiosity or because they, you know, want a miracle or they want to be fed or whatever it might have been. But as they're coming down, we see this, what we've seen all through the book. Jesus and the three, saw a great crowd. And we've talked about over and over again in the book of Mark how that the crowds just continue to grow and they get bigger and bigger the more that the fame of Jesus spreads throughout the area. But what's interesting in verse 14 is what's going on while they're there. The crowd is around the disciples and the scribes are arguing with them. Now, are you really surprised at that? That the scribes are arguing with the disciples? No. Because every time we've seen the scribes or the religious leaders or the Pharisees or whatever it might be, what have they been doing every time? They've been arguing, right? That's the reputation that they've built for themselves in the Gospel of Mark. And we need to make sure that that's not our reputation as well. that we don't just have a reputation of just arguing with people all the time. One of the things that was impressed upon me when I was a young preacher, that I've tried to impress on other guys that I've taught and mentored, the old line, you don't have to show up to every fight you're invited to. There's some people that just want to debate and argue and fight. But I think a lot of times we're the ones that cause that. I mean, I've seen, and I'm not saying we shouldn't teach the truth or we shouldn't stand up for the truth, but there's a right way to do it and a not so right way to do it. And, I've seen, especially social, we were talking about the other day, Jared and Aaron and I, about social media and how, the problems that are numerous about social media. One of the facts that is just a sad reality is people will say things on social media that they would never say to each other face to face. And so you have that kind of arguing mentality that goes on so much on there. You've got, I would have to assume, well-meaning brethren that they'll ask a Bible question. What do you think about something that is a controversial topic or is a matter of opinion topic? Just wondering, what do you think about so-and-so? And then the first person that says something that is on the other side of the coin from then they use that to jump on them and, tear them down and tear them up and all that. And we just need to make sure that that's not the reputation that we develop for ourselves, is that, we want to just argue and debate about everything. That's, again, the reputation that the scribes had. There's nothing that Jesus could do that would please them. And one of the realities that we have to understand is that there's going to be people that there's nothing we can do to please them as well. So at some point, we're just better off realizing that they're wanting a fight, not wanting knowledge. So that's the situation that Jesus and the three step into when they come down the mountain. And then you've got verses 15 through 29, Jesus healing this boy with an unclean spirit. And we'll find out what it is that they were arguing about. When Jesus and the three get down there, it says immediately when they saw him, they recognized who Jesus was. And so you can imagine, it's kind of like whenever you catch your kids and they're arguing and fighting and you walk in the room and they're like, hey, Mom, Dad, and everything is peace and wonderful or whatever. But when they see him, it says that they were greatly amazed and they ran to greet him. So why were they so anxious to meet him? Well, here's again, they're wanting a physical blessing. They're wanting Jesus to heal this boy, but Jesus is going to use it for a spiritual lesson that he's going to teach. Now, we've talked about in the book of Mark all of these different amazed words. It's usually translated as amazed in the English, but there's several of these words in the Greek. This one is a different amazed word than we've seen before. This one means to be moved to an intense emotional state because of a surprise, which again is kind of like when the boys are fighting and I walk in and they are moved to an intense emotional state of fear because I surprised them, Well, that's kind of what's going on here with this. That's why they're amazed. It's not that they're amazed that they see him. I think it's kind of the hand in the cookie jar kind of thing. And so he asked them this question. He says, what were you arguing about with them? What were you fussing about with them? You notice it's in orange, which if you look back up to verse 15, if you've forgotten, that's one of the key words of the book. The word is about seeing. When they're arguing, it's because they're not seeing things the same, is the idea behind it. So what was it that you didn't see the same with them? Well, he gives the answer, I think, in the next verse, in verse 17. Someone from the crowd is the one that's going to answer him. I think it's interesting that it's not the disciples that answered, but someone from the crowd, and says, Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that made him mute. So the problem that's going on here, what it was that they were arguing about, involves this guy who has a son who has this evil spirit. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But he brought him to Jesus, in order to be healed. Now, why would that cause an argument? Well, if you remember back in Mark chapter 3, when Jesus is casting out demons, what did the scribes and the Pharisees, what did they attribute Jesus' ability to cast out spirits to? He working with the devil. So can you imagine how that would cause a controversy now? This guy walks up to where Jesus' followers are and these scribes that are there, and he says, I want someone to heal my boy who's possessed with a demon. And then the scribes say, well, yeah, he can do it because he's working for Satan or whatever it might be. And you can see how an argument would transpire. Those of you that were in the auditorium on Sunday morning, or those of you that have seen the Chosen series, Matthew and I were talking about the other day when he was wanting to use those clips. If you remember when the man from that had the leprosy walked up to Jesus and the disciples while they were walking along the way, and they recognized that he was someone with leprosy, and all the disciples run in front of Jesus and they draw their daggers because they think they need to protect Jesus. And if you've watched the Chosen series, I think they've done a good job of showing how the disciples thought. Again, they're not seeing clearly, but they think part of their job is to be bodyguards for Jesus and take up for him and that type of thing. So you've got these scribes that are insulting Jesus without him there to defend himself. So what are they going to do? We're going to stand up for Jesus and we're going to defend him. And it seems that's what the problem was. In verse 18, this is the Father continuing to speak, but he describes a little bit more what it is that's going on. He says, and whenever that's that spirit, seizes him. Now, sometimes you'll see in the little titles that's been added into your Bible over different sections, or if you look at commentaries or whatnot, they'll talk about this as Jesus healing a boy with epilepsy. And the description that he's going to give sounds a lot like epilepsy. He says that when this spirit seizes him, it throws him down. So if you've seen anyone ever have an epileptic seizure, they usually end up falling down. He foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. If you've ever seen someone have a seizure, that sounds very similar to what's going on. But I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to say Jesus healed someone with epilepsy. Because epilepsy is a medical condition on its own. And Aaron and I today, Cece had sent Aaron a video of a denominational preacher from Middle Tennessee that was basically making the parallel with this and a few other places, that if you had these certain ailments or diseases, that meant that you were demon possessed. And you didn't need to carry your kids to the doctor if they had these things. You just needed to beat the demon out of them, was basically what he was saying. Well, I'm not doubting that what this boy had at least looked like epilepsy. It may have been epilepsy, but the problem wasn't that he had epilepsy. The problem is that he had an evil spirit. Now, you remember earlier, Jesus cast a demon out of a man that was causing him to be mute and to be deaf. He's cast out demons of men that have been blind. Well, are people blind or mute or deaf or have epilepsy not because of demons? Absolutely. There's the blind man that was born blind that the disciples say, hey, who sinned, this man or his father, that he would be born blind? And he said, neither. So that had nothing to do with a demon. So there's people with epilepsy, and this guy may have epilepsy, this child may have epilepsy, but his problem's not epilepsy. Jesus isn't just healing epilepsy. He's casting out a spirit. And you're going to see that because Jesus is going to confirm that this isn't Mark's opinion, that he thinks this is someone who has an evil spirit, or this father, back in those days, they just didn't have the medical technology that we did, and he misdiagnosed it. But Jesus is not going to misdiagnose anything, and he's going to confirm that it's a spirit that maybe caused epilepsy or maybe something similar. I just think there's a point to be made about that, because otherwise it leads us down the road of the guy that I was telling about before, where we don't understand that these demons could cause something that is a known disease, but it's not just that he's healing of that disease. So anyway, that's the condition that his son is in. And then this is probably what really stirred up the problems. He said, so I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. And you can imagine the guy showing up with his son, and he's wanting Jesus to heal him, to remove this demon from his son, and Jesus is nowhere to be found. Well, here's his disciples. And his disciples surely should be able to cast out the demon. And he would think that, because if you turn back in your Bibles back to Mark chapter 6, in Mark chapter 6, Jesus sends the disciples out, and when he does, he gives them the authority to do some certain things. Mark chapter 6 and verse 7, he summoned the 12, and again, there's that distinction there. He summoned the 12 and began to send them out in pairs, and gave them authority over the clean spirits. And he told them that they could do some other things. But while they went out, they had the authority to cast out these evil spirits. Here the man says, I asked your disciples to do it, and the ESV says, were not able. Some translations say they could not or whatever, but the word here is not our usual word for able. It's a word that means that they have the power. They didn't have the power to do this. And so if you think about, and we're going to pause from the text a minute because we need to understand the difference here. This is the word for strength or power. It's not the word for authority to do something, which is what they had before in chapter 6 and verse 7. There's a difference in authority and power. God has power. And while Jesus was on earth, he came in the form of a man, and he was given authority. Remember, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. He was given authority by God, and then the disciples were given authority. And in chapter 6 and verse 7 is where he gave that. Well, what's the difference in power and authority? Michael Hyde always uses this illustration, which I think is great. Police officers in our country do not have the power to make or to break laws, do they? That's a power that only the government, legislation, or elected officials, whether you're talking about city, state, or national, or whatever, they have the power to change laws, or to affect laws, or to strike laws from the book. And then policemen are given the authority to uphold those laws. Does that make sense? See the difference there? So the disciples in chapter 6 were given the authority to cast out demons, but they didn't have the power in and of themselves to do that. The power that they were using was the power of God. And so now, while they're here with this boy, they're not able to do that. Well, why is that? It's because they didn't have the power. They're trying to rely on their own power rather than the authority and God's power. Are you with me? Does that make sense? What really has gone on here is that the disciples the 12 have gotten a little bit too big for the britches. See, we were able to do it before, so now we can do it on our own. By the way, this is not the first nor the last time that the disciples are going to get too big for the britches. In fact, later on in this chapter, we'll probably get to next week, whenever this scene closes and we move on to the next scene, the very next discussion that Jesus has with the disciples is, he asked them again, what were y'all discussing on the road while we were traveling? And you know what their answer comes out to be? They're arguing about who is the greatest. They're arguing about who's the most important. They're arguing about who has the closest relationship with the Lord to be in a position where they're going to be part of that ruling class when Jesus becomes the king of Israel and sits on the throne in Jerusalem. See, they're not seeing clearly. So they're trying to heal by their own power, and they don't have any power. And so verse 19, Jesus answered them and said, O faithless generation. O faithless generation. See, Jesus is disappointed with them. And there's a reason why that he's disappointed with them. I want you to think about, we're going to skip away from the text here for another minute and think about what this statement means. First of all, if you look back a few verses, maybe it's on the same page in your opening, Jesus has talked about this generation in verse 28 verse 12 of chapter 8. When talking about John the Baptist, he said, verse 12, sighing deeply in his spirit, he says, does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. And we talked about at that time that it wasn't that Jesus wasn't going to do any more signs, but he's basically saying, there's not a sign that I can do that's going to satisfy you. That's the generation that I'm living in right now. If you flip on over to verse 38 of chapter 8, he says, for whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation. And we talked about when we looked at that verse about how that what they were committing adultery with, their mistress was the world and their self and their traditions. So that's the generation that Jesus is talking about. Later on in chapter 13 and verse 30, he's going to have something else pretty negative to say about them. But the idea here is that this generation that I'm living in they're not seeing clearly, okay? And there's 4 groups that are involved in all of this that are really in this context. And we're going to make some application about this in just a minute. But you've got the scribes, and the scribes are those who, they're arguing about whether Jesus can do this. They're arguing about whether Jesus is doing this by the power of Satan or whatever it might be. You've got the father. Why did the father bring his boy to Jesus? Why did he bring his son to Jesus? To heal him, right? He wanted the demon cast out. If he brings his boy to Jesus for him to cast the demon out, what does that imply about what the man thought of Jesus? Yeah, he believed in him, right? But we're going to find out here in just a minute that he didn't believe in Jesus as much, at least, as what he did previously. So he was believing in Jesus, but then he kind of, I don't know about this Jesus. And then you've got the crowd, and the crowd are going to, when Jesus heals the boy, they're going to immediately think he kills the boy. So they're not accepting what Jesus is doing. And then you've got the disciples, and the disciples are the 12 especially, the 9 at least that's been there, they're, hey, Jesus isn't here, but hey, we can take care of it. We've got the power, We were talking about it today, and if you're a child, someone that was a child in the 80s and 90s, you'll get both of these references. When I was talking about what we were studying tonight, Aaron and I talking about our different classes, and he said, hearing you talk about that makes me think of He-Man saying, I've got the power. And some of you are smiling, and some of you are older and saying, who's He-Man? He wrote some Psalms, but it's a different He-Man that we're talking about. And then I said, well, what I kept thinking about was the song by Snap, I've Got the Power. And I said, if I could get Jerry to go in there and sing the oh, 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 oh part at the back, then we'd do it. But Jerry wasn't willing to do it. But anyway, you've got the disciples who think that they've got the power and they're able to do whatever Jesus can do. And so, 4 reasons why they're an unbelieving generation. There are some, if I can get up here my marker here, there are some who do not believe. There's some who just don't believe. That would be the scribes, right? This is an unbelieving generation, and so what does that mean? Well, they don't believe. So naturally, there's some people that don't believe. But, part of the unbelieving generation is not necessarily people that we would just say they don't believe. Part of them is like the father who begin to doubt. They believe, but then they begin to doubt what's going on as things go forward in life and things don't turn out the way maybe that we thought they would. And then there's the crowd who gives up too soon. They're arguing with the scribes. They believe in Jesus, but as soon as things don't happen the way they think, they just give up and say, well, there's that. And then there's those who trust in self. And that's the disciples. And if you think about it, all of us that are in this room fit into one of these categories. And at different times in our lives, we've probably fit in more than one of these categories. There's been times where we don't believe, or we really doubt. Maybe somebody in this room that really don't believe, or that wonders why we have to do this, or how can we know that, or whatever. There's lots of people in the world, more and more, that don't believe. But then maybe the other three categories fits us better, is that we believe, and we'll say we believe, and we'll go the extra mile to show our belief, but then when things don't turn out the way we want to, or we're at a crossroads, or there's a big decision to make, or whatever, then we begin to doubt in God. We begin to doubt whether He's going to help us, or whether we can accomplish this or that or whatever. Then there's some of us that give up too soon. I believe and I believe and I believe, but it doesn't happen as fast as I want it to. So, well, I guess it's over. And then maybe more than anything, there's the trusting in self. Don't we do that? I believe in Jesus, but you know who I really believe in? It's Corey. And what I can do, and my abilities, and what I've done in the past, and whatever, to the point that it becomes about me rather than about Him. So that's this generation, and that's the reasons why that Jesus answers in the way that He does when He says, "O faithless generation." It's not just the scribes who didn't believe at all, it's all of these individuals. And so He says in verse 19, He says, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" Jesus is really disappointed. As much as you've seen me do, all of the things that you've seen me do, and you're still doubting, just bring him to me. So verse 20, they bring the boy to Him, and when the Spirit saw him. How many times have we noticed when someone who's possessed by an evil spirit or a demon, when they come to Jesus and they immediately remember Legion? What are you doing with us, Jesus? You're here too early. You know. They recognize who Jesus is. And we've talked about that's because back in Mark chapter 1, Jesus whooped their boss, didn't He? He whooped the strong man. And they know who He is. And so immediately it starts making the boy do what the father said. He convulsed. The boy fell on the ground. He rolled about, foaming at the mouth, just like the father had previously described. And in verse 21, Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood." So it's been going on a while that this boy has had to deal with this. And in verse 22, it says that He's often cast him into the fire. The demon has cast the boy into a fire and into water. Now you remember when we've talked about with Legion and other areas how that it seems at least that the demons are looking when they're cast out for waterless places that they can pass by or pass through. It seems at least that they don't want to go into water. The pigs that went off into the ocean, the pigs died and the demons apparently were destroyed. And we talked about how, you know, the significance maybe that places on baptism or whatnot. But this demon's willing to throw the boy into water, maybe even that would hurt himself to destroy him. He says, but, verse 17, remember this is what He brought him here for. "But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Now he uses the word here for the can you do it? Do you have the authority? Do you have the ability to do this? So see what he's doing here is he's doubting Jesus. We've already said he wouldn't have brought his son to Jesus unless he believed Jesus could do something for him. And now he's saying, but if you can. Well, why is he doubting it? Because the disciples tried and they couldn't. And if his disciples can't, maybe Jesus can't. Maybe he didn't have enough ability to do that. Okay, so verse 23, I love Jesus' response here. Jesus said, if you can. And the ESV puts an exclamation point at the end of this, but I think it would probably be better to have it as, if I can get that turned off there. Quit that. Instead of an exclamation point at the end of can, maybe a question mark. The guy says, if you can heal him. And Jesus says, if you can. What do you mean if I can? But he's doubting him, see? All things are possible for one who believes. And I've got written out, if you literally translated that line, it's all power to the one who is trusting. If I can, you're doubting whether I have the authority to do it. I'm the one that gave the disciples the authority to do it. But you're doubting me. See, he's gone from believing that Jesus could do it to the point that he's now doubting. And, you know, the little comment that I've got written in my Bible and I've got written on here to show you down there in the bottom is how that the close game going on. Don't look at that because I've got it recorded. But you've got the idea that he brought him to Jesus, but now he's doubting. Well, what's made him doubt is the scribes arguing and the disciples' inability to help. And you think about the way that I serve Jesus, does it make other people doubt Jesus? The attitude that I have, or the not keeping my commitments, or the way that I treat other people, or the way that I care for other people, or the kind of husband or father that I am, or whatever, by the way that I'm working or not working, by the way, am I causing other people to doubt Jesus? See, we're representing him. And I need to be asking myself, how am I representing him? So immediately when Jesus says this, immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, and that's present tense. Right now, I believe, help my unbelief. And the Greek there is continuous action. Right now, I'm believing, but I need you to help me believe as I move forward. Well, how's that going to happen if Jesus is able to do what he claims he's able to do? And isn't that the way that we are? Is that I believe right now, you know, I'm teaching the Wednesday night class. The people that are here tonight, you're here because you believe in Jesus, right? But the first time things go sideways, or the first time things don't happen the way that I think they should, or the first time that a prayer is answered in a different way, do I suddenly stop believing? See? So verse 25, when Jesus saw that the crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. So Jesus casts him out, and after Jesus does, immediately it says in verse 26 that after crying out and convulsing very terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so most of them said, he is dead. You know, it's a little bit of problem that the boy has to go through to get it out. Sometimes removing our spiritual demons is physically exhausting. But he does come out. But when he comes out, the boy falls down like he's dead, so the crowd immediately says, well, that's it, he's dead. in chapter 8, Jesus healed the blind man, and there's been, I told you then, there's commentators that have written that, it took Jesus 2 times because he didn't use enough power. Well, basically the crowd is saying, well, he used too much power. He Shazammed him, and now he's dead. Is Jesus messing up on how much power he's using? Well, of course not. But that's what they thought. So Jesus takes him by the hand. By the way, interesting study sometime is to go through the Gospels and read all the different places Jesus takes somebody by the hand. It's a pretty impressive study to think about the compassion Jesus has. And he lifted him up, and he arose. So the boy is not really dead after all. And then when he'd entered the house, his disciples asked him privately. Now, we've talked about this all through Mark, is that disciples, followers of Jesus, are learners. And if they don't understand something, they keep asking questions. And sometimes we get a little bit disappointed in ourselves or whatever. And I hate to ask this question. I'll have people sometimes, I know this is a dumb question. No, it's not. Because if you're asking about something about the Bible or spiritual things, you know what it tells me about you? That you're a learner. You're a follower of Jesus. That's what followers do, is they want to learn. So his disciples asked him, why could we not cast it out? Now here we go back to our authority and power discussion. Why is it that we could not cast him out? Why did we not have the power to cast him out? And he said to him, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Or literally, this kind no one has the power to make come out except through prayer. See, the problem is that you couldn't, and people will sometimes, what was this, some kind of, this was the Delta Force of demons or something, But the problem wasn't that this demon was any necessarily more powerful than any other. The problem is that they're trying to drive it out by their power, and they don't have power. They have authority. And when you pray, what are you asking? You're asking God for His power to give you the authority to do it. Does that make sense? So the disciples, their problem is that they tried to cast out these demons this demon by their power, and Jesus says, you don't have any power. You can't do this unless you ask God, because He's the one with the power. God has the power. No person has the power. So that's why they must ask God. They didn't have power. They had authority. And since they were trying to cast this demon out by their power, is why they couldn't do it. See, they're still not seeing clearly. They're still not understanding what Jesus is doing and whatnot. So, it's easy to say we believe, but what do we do when we doubt? Do we give up or walk away too soon? Do we trust in self? Are we causing others to doubt with our actions? Those are questions we need to ask ourselves. And then, real quickly, let's look at verses 30 through 32, because it, I think, connects very closely with this. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and He did not want anyone to know. This is, again, the Messianic secret, and maybe it's not real clear in this verse if He just didn't want them to know He's passing through, or He didn't want to know about what He did. But either way, He's trying to keep the crowds down. And the reason why is because, verse 31, He was teaching His disciples. Why is He teaching to them? Because they're still not seeing clearly. That's been evidenced by what's just happened in this previous account. So He gives them now the fourth suffering statement that we see in the second half of the book. The previous one was in verses 11 through 12 of chapter 9. The next one, and probably the most detailed one, is going to be coming up in chapter 10, verses 32 through 35. But again, three facts that He's trying to help them understand. The Son of Man is going to be delivered, the word there is the word for betrayed, into the hands of men. Number 2, they will kill Him, and when He is killed, number 3, after 3 days, He will rise. I got to get you to understand, this is not about being large and in charge and me kicking out the Romans and sitting on a throne and making Israel a powerful nation and you having positions of power and influence and wealth. That's not what this is about. Yes, Peter, I am the Messiah. Yes, I am the Son of God. What that means is not that I'm going to sit on a throne on this earth. It means that I'm going to be throned on a cross. I'm going to be put to death. I'm a suffering servant. Verse 32, but they did not understand. Are you surprised? Remember back in chapter 9 and verse 10 when Jesus is with them up there, they didn't understand either. They're coming down the mountain and they're saying, we don't understand what's going on. That's when Peter, spoke up last time. This time it says that they were afraid to ask him. There comes a point to where you ask the teacher so many times and you're almost embarrassed. I know you've explained this 4 times, but can you explain it one more time? They're almost embarrassed to ask at this point. They're afraid. And maybe it's because they saw how disappointed Jesus was the last time. But the problem is are we ever afraid to ask? So what do disciples do? They ask, right? Has Jesus been giving them answers when they ask questions? Has he been giving them explanations? Well, of course. But the problem is the fact that their mindset of what's going on is still wrong. And so you get down to verse 33, which we'll get into next week. And again, you start off with this, they're arguing about who's the greatest. Because they don't ask, because they're not willing to listen, they're still going to struggle with the same things over and over. And so will we if we're not followers of Jesus and asking the question. So, again, really cool section because of what you see Jesus do and the interaction that he has both with the scribes and the people and the Father and the disciples. But it's some powerful lessons for us to think about as we study about Jesus, as we study from the New Testament. Do we fit in the category of thinking, well, I've got it and we can't be taught? That I've got it and God's pretty lucky to have me on his side? Or are we continuing to be students of the Word and followers of Jesus? All right, let me give you a few announcements before we're dismissed. Here in just a minute in prayer by Mike, we're going to got a shorter sick list, thankfully, than normally, but we still have several that are struggling with physical issues and those types of things. I don't know, are we offline yet? Courtney, those of you that are online, you'll get an update and you can see some of these that we'll talk to. But you can refer to the